IPS midterm meeting in Lima. I am Claudia Marsico and I am going to coordinate this part of the conference. We will begin right now with the presentation of Stephanides from Christ College, Cambridge. Its title is Plato and the Mechanics of Koinonia-Formation. Please, Stephanos, we are hearing you.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
And see the screen, very good. So let me take this opportunity to thank the organisers for their invitation and also to the previous speakers for their excellent presentations. On the screen, you'll see my handout. I've also put it in the chat box in case you want to flick through when I'm done screen sharing at the end. But what you will see on the handout is just the kind of main text that I'm working with in today's talk. We won't be able to go through all of them today, so if you do have any questions on some of the text that we won't be able to cover today, please do ask in the Q&A. At the top of the handout, you'll see this very famous quote from chez, according to which there was a sign at the entrance of Plato's academy saying, you know, the one not versed in geometry shouldn't be able to enter, and there's a close association of equality, justice with geometry. And I think that will give us a real sense of the importance of geometry in this paper. So without further ado, I'll begin my time now and go straight into the paper. So it's well known that the term koinonia is highly charged, not only in the philosophy of Plato, but also in standard Greek thought generally. Broadly construed, the term seems to have signified some sort of shared or joint relation amongst a plurality based on dynamic exchange, inclusiveness, and collectivism. Physicians, politicians, and natural philosophers alike were driven by the question of how to create well-functioning systems amidst complexity. The Greek psyche was all too conscious of the potential threat that conflict and discord might pose to the complex structures, specifically the polis, that pervaded their reality. What might be said to be lacking in our reception of koinonia, however, is a study on the very mechanics of how best to form a koinonia-based relationship. That is to say, our understanding of koinonia is only half complete until further substantive explanation is given to the antecedent principles or rules that go into making a particular instance of koinonia. So let me briefly distinguish between two different senses of koinonia. There's on the one hand, a non-normative or basic sense of koinonia, according to kind of simple interactions, negotiations, exchanges. And what's important for me to note there is that no prior forethought or intelligent planning is necessarily, only that some joint activity between two or more parties has taken place. And I think that can then be contrasted with a more normative, complex sense of koinonia, according to pre-established, rich, stronger bonds. And that's the type I'm principally concerned with here. But it's perhaps unconsciously taken for granted that koinonia in this normative sense simply exists. So the question we have to ask, I believe, is how these relationships come about in the first place. What are the necessary prerequisites for koinonia formation? And I think this concern is not only of central interest for ancient theories of koinonia in general, but even more so for Plato, who put special emphasis on koinonia as an aim for political and human striving. So one passage which for me won't suffice as an explanation of what I'm looking for is T1 on your handout from Thucydides' Histories, where his speaker emphasizes similarity of character, homoiotropoi, as one of these features that's conducive to creating philia and cooperation between cities. Now, I don't mean to dismiss the importance of homoiotropoi to civic togetherness and unity, only that this falls short of establishing in more technical detail those internal relations that really hold the koinonia together. So I think we're still justified to ask for a technically robust and conceptually sophisticated explanation for universal koinonia formation. So we need something to determine how certain relations come to be held among a plurality of disparate parts. And it's my contention here that Plato was the first philosopher, or one of them, to put the question in this way. In his writings, I'm going to suggest, there's a conscious attempt to explore the ideal principles or rules that are necessary for long-lasting koinonia of the normative type. So my motivation can be reformulated like this. What for Plato are the bonds that best foster koinonia relationships, creating a sense of long-lasting community amongst a plurality? And owing to the several different explanations one could give in response, Here I'd like to focus on just one aspect I take to be central to an appreciation of Koinonia in Plato, and that's proportionality. So the passages I've selected and my analysis of them are restricted to their bearing on the importance of proportionality. Now, one text that I think very straightforwardly highlights the link between Koinonia and proportionality is this T5 from Plato's Definitiones, or disputed work at least. Under the heading of taxis order, we have symmetria koinonias. And koinonia is here translated as society, no doubt because of the strong political overtones of the word. But I think order can be kind of broad enough so as to cover the proportionality of all koinonia, not just the city. But what exactly do we mean by such a broad concept as proportionality? Put simply, a proportionate relation is one where there's some similarity of terms in accord with a mathematically defined ratio or formula. So the task of the person who's going to remedy conflict and create order from a pre-existing state of complexity is to calculate those precise ratios that are appropriate for fostering a certain relation among things in a given context. But our ancient sources make it clear that already by the time of Plato's writing activity, proportionality could be expressed by a number of specific ways. And that's T2 on the handout, which is from Archytas' fragment 2, a rather lengthy text that we won't be able to go through in great detail now. What I want you to note is the mention of these three different proportional means, the arithmetic, the geometric, and the third subcontrary, which is also called the harmonic. And however illuminating this discovery might be, it might make our challenge, our task of interpreting proportionality in Plato a bit more challenging. So the question is, when Plato does engage with proportionality, is he drawing on the general study of proportion, so analogia in general, or is he prioritizing a specific model of proportionality? And I think we can get a much richer account by seeing Plato prioritize and operate with a specific model. So one place in the corpus where proportionality and koinonia are linked is the Gorgias. That's text 3 on the handout. You'll see that I've divided the passage into two separate chunks. The first shows Socrates' evaluation of Callicles' pleonectic lifestyle. And of course, he draws out two different relations that he's unable to form koinonia with men and also with God. And I'll return to why that is the case in the moment and what koinonia relationships with our fellow people and with the gods might actually look like. But first, I want to turn to the second half of the passage, where Socrates famously chides Callicles for failing to notice the great power that geometrical equality, he isotes he geometrike, holds among gods and men. Among gods and men seems broadly unrestricted, and since this coupling was just paired with heaven and earth, we ought to assume that geometrical equality holds great sway over the entire universe. So this means that proportionate relations secure all the koinonia within the cosmos. Koinonia, one might put it, requires geometrical equality. So clearly an understanding of geometry is at least a necessary condition for fostering koinonia relationships. But I think two questions seem to present themselves at this stage. The first is, how would our lives with our relationships with others be transformed to accommodate for koinonia if we were well versed in geometrical equality, and what exactly would that look like? And the second is, what exactly is encompassed in the term geometrical equality anyway? And since an answer to that second question holds the key to the more practical concerns of the first question, I want to now turn to an examination of the key phrase geometrical equality and its place within the context of the dialogue. So as far as I can see, two competing interpretations have emerged in literature. On the one hand, there's a deflationary reading according to which geometrical equality refers generally to all mathematical proportions, irrespective of those more specific instantiations of proportional means in Archytas' fragment 2. And there's some evidence for geometry being understood in a kind of general, broad way much earlier in the dialogue. On the other hand, the more classic interpretation suggests that geometrical equality refers to the geometric mean in particular. That is the proportion that Plato will end up with in the Timaeus, where he describes the friendly relation that holds between the four elements of the world body proportionality is the binding principle par excellence there. But saying that the geometric mean in particular here is the one that Plato is favoring is not to say that the other proportions aren't important to Callicles' education, only that one proportion is most conducive to combating pleonexia and creating koinonia. And to argue for that, within the dialogue, two diverging ways of life have been offered. On the one hand, the many were said to espouse the theory that justice is equality, where we can assume Plato has in mind pure democratic equality, so corresponding to the arithmetic proportion of T2, while Callicles sets up his support for pleonexia, probably in opposition to that form of absolute democratic equality. So is the point not that a third, altogether preferable alternative has completely escaped Callicles' notice? Socrates can agree with the many that justice consists in equality without also having to endorse their specific version of democratic equality. And if he did, I think his remarks in the Republic to the effect that democracy dishes out a certain equality to both equals and unequals alike would be out of place. So for now, though, while Callicles' model of pleonexia isn't the preferred option, I want to suggest that a version of that model will survive once it's undergone radical revision. So we'll remember that at the core of Callicles' theory is the idea that those who are superior ought to be given more. And at one point, the superior man is even equated with the wise man. And that's a point that Plato would hardly disagree with. Socrates agrees with Callicles that the wise should indeed be given more and should rule over the unwise. But the untenability of Callicles' position is that he wants to endorse that innocuous principle and at the same time maintain that everything should be concentrated in the hands of those superior, even if that means taking more than is due or right and encroaching on the demands of others. For Socrates, the just rulership of the wise man does not entail that he should take all the benefits that are accrued from his leadership of the city. And he quite suggestively puts the questions to Callicles, I quote, "Shouldn't he, the wise man, rather have more than some and less than others?" End quote. So inequalities might still persist there. The wise will have more than the unwise, but overall equality ensues since the wise deserve more by virtue of their merit, and that won't exclude the less deserving from having some share. And that, I think, is one way in which geometrical equality could in theory manifest in the koinonia of the state. So we're now in a position to attempt a response to our first question, how an appreciation of geometrical proportionality in the technical sense, as I've argued, translates into koinonia-based relationships. So turning back to the first chunk of our T3, I alluded earlier to relations with the gods and relationships with men. And taking the gods first, in light of our examination of geometrical equality, I think this becomes even more lucid. We have to respect that the gods are superior than us and give them more power, and also recognize our place as inferior when compared to the gods. And there's a passage in Eric Xenakis's eulogy to Eros in the Symposium, where, of course, he speaks of the causal efficacy of love in bringing hostile opposites together. And he says, we have to recognize the great power of the gods, that they're stronger than us. And similarly, in our relationships with others in the community, Callicles needs to put the desires in his soul into a sort of geometrical progression so that he can have a fit with his fellow citizens. And in the political sphere, as long as we stay within the limits of what's deserving to each, I think friendly interaction is made possible between potentially unequal and opposite members of society. So in that way, people can see themselves as part of a collective shared community based on mutual fellowship rather than harsh inequalities. So with those remarks, for the remainder of the paper, I want to demonstrate that an awareness of proportionality, broadly construed, as a key explanatory principle for koinonia formation runs through Plato's political dialogues. Now, one dialogue I did want to discuss, and it's in the main version of the paper, is the statesman, but for purposes of time, I'm going to have to skip that. So if you do have any questions on the place of the statesman within my narrative and the importance of proportionality to koinonia formation there, then please do ask in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'd like to turn to Plato's most discussed political dialogue, and that, of course, is the Republic. So while proportionality is not as explicitly emphasized as it is in the dialogues we've surveyed so far, I'd like to show that proportionate relations still govern the koinonia of the city in the Republic. And I think we can speculate what type of proportion is best suited to the tripartite political framework of the ideal state, and what implications this might have for situating the Republic within Plato's interest in proportionality and Koinonia-Formation. So first, it's clear that the supreme motivating principle for the politics of the Republic is how to foster civic unity. Socrates warns that when factions arise, the city becomes pluralized rather than unified, and the main response for Plato in the Republic, as Catalin Partenni's paper yesterday so eloquently demonstrated, is that we need the principle of justice, according to which each does its own without impinging on the domain of another. So each may become a single person rather than many, and the city may become single rather than many. So a minimum requirement for the unity of the city is that each performs and recognizes its own function. In fact, this specialization of functions is also necessary if there's going to be a genuine koinonia in the city as all. So as early as Book 2, Plato's principle of justice is said to allow different people to be associates and helpers, koinonos te kai boethos, with each other, since each farmer or artisan makes his product common to all, koinon, sharing koinonunta it with others. Socrates finally concludes that this was the main reason for forming an association in the first place, and that's T8 on your handout. The desired koinonia of the city is then encapsulated even more vividly in this famous proverb, namely that everything should be shared among friends. And how that maxim might become embodied in the community is the task of Book 5 of the dialogue to work out. Book 5 begins by challenging the famous proverb and saying that we have to apply it in the right way. And one initial starting point for Socrates is to say that the guardians need to assume the role of guardians of the herd. So all the subsequent relations that follow have to have some bearing to the ruling class, which assumes control over the whole city. And one relation that's especially discussed is the taking of wives, children, etc. But those relations are restricted in their scope. It's only true to say that the sharing of wives, children are in common within solely the guardian class, and that's T9 on your handout. Similarly, with pleasures and pains, there's this famous analogy according to which if one part of the body, the finger, feels a pain, then the whole body will feel the pain. And if one part of the community is hurting, then the whole will hurt. But that again seems restricted to solely the guardian class. So whereas the lower classes will refer to the guardians as saviors and helpers and defenders, the rulers will refer to each other as relatives, as kin. So I wonder whether that's consistent with Plato's remarks elsewhere that the unity of the city is a matter of the whole, all of the classes included. And I think an appreciation of the noble lie might be helpful here. The function of the noble lie is to show that all the citizens derive from one common autochthonous origin, and in that way they can see themselves as one family. But those relations are a mere far cry from the stronger relations that exist within the guardian class. In fact, as long as factions don't arise within the guardian class, there's no danger of the rest of the city being divided. So that assumes a high degree of functional responsibility to the guardians, who operate as the overall unifying principle for the city. And when the city does break down, it's because the guardians fail to observe the right marriage and breeding relations. The perfect geometrical number evades them, which leads to them then disregarding the essential class separation between iron, bronze, gold, and silver. And Socrates says, I quote, "You will get unlikeness and discordant inequality. And when you get those, they always breed war and hostility." So that illustrates just how important class identification and separation is to the ideal state of Kallipolis. I think that provides an appropriate segue to discussing interclass relations within the Republic. So if harmony, likeness, and equality are going to prevail, and if that's achieved by maintaining the separateness of the classes, we ought to ask whether there are any other socioeconomic conditions that maintain that class structure. And here again, I think an awareness of proportionality will be helpful. So what I have in mind is specifically formal equality, as it's put by Vlastos in one of his papers, where each class receives only what's equal to it, and they only receive an equal distribution of rights so that they can perform their individual function. But nothing said whether within each class, if someone performs their function very well, that they'll get more of those benefits in response. And that's what we would expect if Plato was operating with geometrical proportionality, but I don't think he does in the Republic. And things are a bit more complex in the case of the guardians. Since they do most for the city, we would expect that they get more in return. But of course, they have their rights severely curtailed. And that's probably as compensation for the large amount of power that they do have. And also, again, because of the principle of justice. If the guardians were to get what the auxiliaries or the others have, that might, as it were, corrupt them and derail them from their care of the whole community. But in one respect, the powers of the guardian class do disproportionately outweigh and dominate the whole community. So despite the socioeconomic equalities just mentioned, the political inequalities of Kallipolis are severe. So the right to participate in the functions of government are restricted to a few individuals preeminent in wisdom. And this is why Plato disavows geometrical proportionality in the Republic, because that involves giving more to those that are deserving and less to those who are less deserving. So it's been suggested, turning back to our list of different proportions in T2, that Plato may have been operating with the harmonic proportion in the Republic, since that recognizes merit to an even greater degree than the geometric kind. I can't go into the precise mathematics here, but a simple harmonic progression shows that the differences in terms is much greater than in the geometric. And there is, of course, a strong connection with harmony and music in the Republic, which may make it more likely that Plato was engaging with the harmonic mean here, but that's only a matter of speculation. But it's clear that Plato still thinks the hierarchical model is the key to achieving philia and koinonia in the whole city. So in this famous passage towards the end of Book 9, T10 on the handout, Plato says the person whose reasoning element is weak ought to be regarded as the slave, the doulon of the best person. And Plato is at pains to stress elsewhere that the subjugation of the lower classes is ultimately consented to. It's not that they're forced into a hierarchical relation. They have some vague understanding that this is the best relation for them. And to that extent, they may have some grasp of sophrosune, which is agreement on which part should rule. In summary, while koinonia is not especially flagged in T10, I think we can fairly assume that as well as being equal in friends, homoioi kai philoi, all the citizens of Kallipolis will also be koinon when the wise element in the city rules over and puts each into its proper place. Each realizes that they're an important part of a collective whole and shared experience, and that what binds them together, giving each its unique identity, is the divine element ruling over the whole city. But what's up for debate here is to what extent we find this koinonia to be successful. Despite the strong impression the Republic gives of civic cohesion, the koinonia of the city is also predicated on an inflexible class system, which disenfranchises the lower parts from having a right to political participation. And we could protest that this isn't consistent with equality at all. It's definitely not consistent with geometrical equality, which does give more to the more deserving, but still gives out some share of what is due to the less deserving. Finally, the koinonia of the family relations, of pleasures and pains, of a sense of kinship to one another, which in the laws is said to be suitable only for gods and children of gods, seems restricted to relations within the guardian class. And this emphasis on the unity intrinsic to the guardian class, combined with the grave inequalities in the political sphere, I think puts into doubt the very plausibility of koinonia as the Republic envisages it. Plato's final political work, and the one which I'll conclude this paper with, provides a striking contrasting model of koinonia, a model which both takes us back to Plato's musings on geometrical proportion in the Gorgias and builds on the statesman and the technical dimension of due measure, dometrion, between different extremes there. And one feature that immediately sets the laws apart from any of Plato's other political dialogues, is the emphasis given to freedom, eleftheria, as a principal aim for the lawgiver. So the Athenian says that if a city is going to be free, it has to observe due measure, dometron, between two different extremes, monarchy and democracy respectively. And the two main archetypes of these different constitutions are, of course, Athens and Persia. And I'm interested in the specific examples of Persia given earlier in the dialogue, where Cyrus was said to achieve dometron between those extremes. So let's have a closer look at these texts. I'm thinking of text 11 now, specifically. The freedom alluded to in this passage encompasses the ability of Cyrus's subjects to participate in the functions of government. If there were too much freedom, the city might lack the direction it needs to make good decisions, and that might lead to the whole city breaking down. It's not that there shouldn't be a ruling principle, because the Athenian says that in any gathering or association whatsoever, koinonia, it's right that in each and every case there should be a directive principle. The issue at stake is what sort of relationship between ruler and ruled best fosters a friendly community. And one thing the passage clearly demonstrates at the end is a certain community of mind, nous koinonian. So if there's someone phronimos among the soldiers, rather than having their views silenced, they're actively encouraged to participate in the king's decision-making. Giving other individuals the freedom to contribute to the functions of government is a significant check on excessive kingly power. And I suspect that such a pooling of ideas, nous koinonian, also engenders a more authentic and long-lasting sense of koinonia in society as a whole. There's also an example in your T12 from Persia under the time of Darius, who was also said to introduce some degree of common equality, isoteta koinen, creating friendship and community among all the Persians, philian kai koinonian. What I'm interested in here is the specific mention of equality. We also had it in the previous Cyrus passage, where Cyrus was told to put everyone on an equal footing, ebi to ison agontes. But since these are by nature monarchies, I think equality is being conceived of along nuanced lines. And Plato does provide a much clearer account of the equality that he's operating with towards the end of the laws. So in book 6 of the dialogue, in a reference back to the material that I've given you from the laws so far, Plato reinforces the message that we need to have the metrion between monarchy and democracy. And he also says, and this is very important, that slaves and masters can never be friends. So that should already serve as a reminder that we're verging on quite different territory from the Republic. That dialogue emphasized friendship and equality as desiderata for the rulers of the city. We also saw such friendship was predicated on the lower members assuming a position of quasi-slavery towards the best. And that slavery coincided with the fact that the lower classes were obstructed from participating in the functions of government. So if, as I've suggested, we're being urged to think of equality along nuanced lines, and if that bears a strong relationship to the statement slaves and masters can never be friends, then what equality is Plato operating with in the laws? And this is T13, which I'm going to end with today, where Plato begins by saying that the view of the majority is wrong, that the lowly, the phauloi, and the good, the spoudaio, are on an equal footing, since, I quote, equality between people who are not equal and the absence of any proportion amounts to inequality. So while it's true that equality creates friendship, the precise type of equality is far from clear. So you'll see that the first equality here employs measurement. It seems to correspond to the arithmetic proportion of T2, the Archytas fragment, whereas the second is quite clearly a reference to the geometrical equality, since it allocates more to what is greater and less to what is lesser, and giving each a measure related to its nature, duly allocates to each what's appropriate to it. And this is precisely what statesmanship needs, so that there's neither a handful of tyrants or some kind of popular control, but always justice. So by way of those illustrations from Cyrus and Darius, as I earlier suggested, these considerations take us back to the Gorgias, where geometrical proportionality was first highlighted as the binding principle par excellence for well-ordered wholes, and builds on the explanatory framework of the statesman, where we have tometron between different extremes. According to my reconstruction, though, it looks as though the rigid and inflexible class system of the Republic stands out as a sort of anomaly. But even there, an appreciation of proportionality is still at work in the Koinonia of the city, albeit a proportional model that Plato will eventually abandon when he has his final say in the laws. What I hope to have shown is nevertheless consistent throughout is the central place of proportionality to Koinonia-Formation in Plato's thought. I've argued that Koinonia, while being a normative condition of complex wholes, presupposing some level of functionality among different parts, needs to be supplemented with an investigation into the principles and prerequisites that go into making a koinonia good. As Plato freely experiments with different structural models in different dialogues, so does his application of proportionality for koinonia formation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stephanos. Well, we have time for questions. A lot of claps. Well, I can begin with a question. Could you say something more about your view about the link between koinonia, in the way you describe it, and the notion of justice? And in the same line, going beyond Plato, do you think that this view is consistent in some sense with the Aristotle description in the Nicomachean Ethics, in the book 5?
You'll have to remind me of what exactly Aristotle says in book 5, but as far as I can remember, Aristotle does also say that everyone says that justice is equality. What they disagree on is exactly what type of equality is most conducive to koinonia. And I think he also has some very important things to say about the geometrical equality that this is the kind of fairest model of justice. This is the best kind of model of equality. So to that extent, I think he's in agreement with Plato, probably picking up more on this emphasis on geometrical equality, symmetria, that we find quite a lot in Plato's late dialogues.
Okay.
May I?
Yes, of course.
Thank you for the paper. I enjoyed it very much. This is merely a suggestion, but when you were talking about geometric proportion, the things being proportioned at first seemed to be goods and services. Then it seemed to be political power. And in the Republic, obviously, goods and services are not proportionally dealt out, nor is clearly political power. But, and this is a question which has intrigued me for a long time, is there a kind of geometric proportion among social functions or civic functions? That is, the function of rulers, the function of the military police, and the function of the artisan class. Can that be seen to be, those different functions, can they be seen to be in some geometric proportion?
Well, I've put the stress on the separation of those classes. I struggle to see how they can be kind of put into some sort of geometrical progression, since they're also separate and they all have their own kind of distinct, unique function. So if there is some proportionality there, I think it's kind of a strict equality given to those kind of three different classes. And I'm not sure how, it's an open question, but you know, Plato doesn't really say much about proportionality in the Republic. I suggested that maybe he was working with the harmonic proportion because that, you know, maintains the separation between the classes even more and gives more to the ruling class, which assumes kind of most control over the whole city. But I think it's inconsistent with the geometrical equality, which we've seen both in the Gorgias and in the laws, which kind of, you know, recognizes freedom, gives more to those that are deserving and less to those that are not. So that won't exclude, you know, the lower classes from having some right to participate in the functions of government. So I guess when I speak of geometrical proportionality in the Republic, I'm thinking mostly about political functions, political participation. And even in the case of, you know, even in the case of social functions, you know, each class receiving kind of what it needs to perform its function, nothing said whether certain individuals within each class will get more if they perform their function better. And I think that's, again, probably a subtle reminder that, that Plato's not operating with the geometrical proportion in the Republic, but I'd be happy for suggestions to the contrary. If anyone, you know, if anyone had any. Is there another question?
I think 4 people have their hands up at least, so I'm just, you know, waiting for someone to give a signal to say something.
I cannot
Okay.
see.
Oh, you have 4 people having hands up. If you've put the gallery, I don't know in which language your program is. Well, anyway, I'll ask mine then. So thank you. It was very interesting to see all these passages put together. I had just a clarificatory question as what you mean exactly by, you know, principle. You said principle for Koinonia-Formation. Yeah. And I was wondering what you mean by principle here, especially if we try to apply what you said to other domains and you know, where Koinonia is used, and that is not about politics. And I was wondering whether you'd be happy with something like necessary conditions, something like this. So yeah, that was my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think outside of the political context, we can still conceive of ways in which, you know, proportionality might still be really important. And this is drawing on the material from the Statesman that I would have included in the main part of the paper, because it's said there that not just the statesman, but all craftsmen, everyone who has a techne, creates a well-ordered whole with reference to tometrion. So essentially what they do is they're taking 2 different extremes and finding the right mean in between those extremes, finding the right proportion, so that we can have koinonia in all types of objects, you know, even outside of the political sphere.
Christoph, do you have a question?
No, I think Edward and Ekaterina were before me. I'm the third and last in the row.
Okay, Edward, here you are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the paper. I wonder whether there is a dimension of this issue that you have minimized a bit. And when you talked about the Gorgias, Callicles is in a particularly difficult position, because there's a little, when he's introduced, there's a sequence about he's always chasing after Deimos. And his idea of proportionality, ironically, is somewhat close to Socrates, as you suggested. And but he can't say that, because he has to attain what power he has by convincing the population. So the someone who wants to establish a genuine koinonia has to do the opposite, it seems, of what most people in the state are going to need, certainly in the Athenian state, in the case of Callicles, but also in the Republic. There has to be somehow a noble lie so that people will be willing to accept what is some sort of proportionality, whether it's harmonic or geometric is not clear.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing in the other political situations. On the one hand, there is what is real equality. I think you were very good in spelling that out. And on the other hand, most people don't. You have to have a knowledge that most people don't have to appreciate that, and that's the political problem.
Right. The knowledge that people do vary in the degree to their wisdom. Right. So probably some sort of, persuasion is necessary there. Maybe everyone needs to kind of buy into this idea that, I'm receiving what's due and what's proportionate to me, and so is the other person. So even if they're receiving more, that's fair, that's proportionate, and that's balanced. So if I'm receiving less, it's fine that I'm receiving less because I'm receiving what's due and what's in accordance with what I deserve. So, I think that ensues this overall fairness and this equality that engenders a much stronger koinonia. In response to your first point about Callicles, yes, I agree that what he puts on the table is strikingly close to what Socrates will end up with. And I think it is an underappreciated dimension to Callicles that he can offer some important considerations. And that's precisely what I'm trying to do. But of course, the point with Callicles is that he wants to go much further. He wants to go to the extreme. He wants to take more. He wants to have more, even if he's superior. But that then comes at the cost of encroaching on the other.
Or you could say he doesn't appreciate what the wise really deserve.
Well, I think he sorry, say that again.
He does not appreciate what the wise really deserve.
What they right. So he appreciates that they deserve ruling over the unwise, but he doesn't appreciate that this needs to be done in such a way that is just and which doesn't create excess or kind of encroaching on what the others might be allowed to have.
Or what they really deserve is not material, something else. But I'm going to stop here because other people are anxious to ask questions here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Caterini?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. I thought that it was very complete and full. I would only like to ask, if possible, some more clarifications and definitions to be able to define better the differences between the geometric and the harmonic proportion.
Yeah. So the arithmetic seems to have corresponded to I mean, I'm not going to go into the mathematics here. I'll have to kind of write down what an arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic progression really is. But the arithmetic is literally a kind of equal or purely equal, ratio of terms. What's one term is the same as the next term and the next and so forth. The geometric, the terms in between are kind of all equal in such a way that, how can I put it? Well, I think the Archytas fragment would actually be quite helpful there. He says that in the geometric proportion, such that as the first is to the second, so the second is to the third. Of these terms, the greater and the lesser make an equal interval. So that recognizes a kind of different sort of equality, whereas in the case of the harmonic equality, which apparently the Pythagoreans were said to prefer, because it recognizes merit to an even greater degree. So the difference between the highest term and the rest of the terms is even greater than it is in the geometrical progression. And if my kind of tentative speculation is right, I think probably Plato's operating with that in the Republic. Now, whether he's being directly inspired by Archytas or by the Pythagoreans, who are said to really favor the harmonic proportion, is really an open question. And you have to really kind of work out, you know, exactly what sort of what sort of proportion is at work in the Republic. Whereas I think it's quite clear in the case of the Gorgias, if I'm right, that her isotes, her geometricae corresponds to the geometric mean, which is then taken up in the laws. I think that's a very, very clear indication of the geometric mean. But I can provide some kind of further literature on the distinction between these means and also their kind of mathematical illustrations as well.
Thank you.
Christoph?
May I?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
You were asking for I would have a lot to say, but maybe I will write you an email because
Okay.
that's long for you. You were asking for instances of geometric means with geometric proportions. I think there are one very, very prominent one and one that is a bit more disputable. The first one is, I think that fits well to Raoul's presentation yesterday, linking ontology and society, so to speak, because in the end, the analogy of the line is a geometric proportion. And if we think of Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics 5:6, he has this continuous and discrete geometric analogy. And in fact, the way how the analogy of the line works is the mathematical way of making a discrete geometrical analogy into a continuous geometrical analogy. So I think that, of course, there it's ontology and not the society, but I think it's very, very prominent one. And the second one is in the nuptial number. If we have the reconstruction of Geyser, there we have a clear geometric progression of cube numbers. Yeah. And there again, he plays with that. So I think that are two indications of clear occurrences of the geometric mean in the Republic. But I have some more, and I can send it to you because I think we are.
Sure. I'll take a closer look at the line. The other example from the Republic was
the nuptial number, the wedding number, or how it.
Oh right, yeah. Well, it's just said that. Yeah. Okay. I guess
depends on how you reconstruct it.
I guess a much clearer place where we actually have a kind of explicit example of a geometrical progression is in the Timaeus, where Plato speaks of the kind of binding principle which brings the four elements of the world body into analogiae kai symmetriae. And that's also said to bring them into philia as well. What it would mean for the four elements of the world body to be into philia is a different matter altogether, but that's probably one context where Plato is clearly kind of operating with the geometric proportion. So that might be helpful also for Ekaterina's question on what the geometrical proportion actually looks like. I think it's around 31 and following in the Timaeus.
Thank you, Stephanos. We have more questions, but we are on time. So now we are going to hear Taha Karagoz from Sorbonne University. He's going to talk about Koinonia as a linguistic combination of letter names and logos in Plato.
Firstly, I want to thank the organizers and the participants for creating this possibility of dialogue. I'm very happy to participate. So, in this presentation, I will investigate the linguistic meaning of the concept of koinonia in Plato's Sophist, which consists of three aspects: articulation of letters, predication of names, and accord homologia of logoi. before starting, I would like to remark about our conception of linguistic. The linguistic meaning of communion isn't merely one among its many meanings. On the contrary, language, logos, has a central position in Plato's thought. Consulting lines 260a of the Sophist, we can see that logos is depicted as a genus kind family which connects other kinds to each other. In this sense, logos is the first concept that should be consulted to get an idea of everything, topan, as logos functions by bringing together all kinds to ensure the unity of topan. In this way, we can conclude that linguistic communion is not about a specific sense of communion, but about the communion of everything. In this context, I have firstly constructed my problem on the distinction between syntax and semantics. In formal language theory, the establishment of language is carried out in the following stages. 1. Identifying the elements of the language as characters and symbols. 2. Syntactic level selection of formulas according to well-formed formula rules. And 3. Semantic level, by collecting these produced formulas in two sets, establishing a function which allows an element in one set to signify another element in another set. According to this theory, the first level to emerge is the symbols, then the syntactic level, and last the semantic level. I will discuss whether Plato too constructs linguistic relations in this way, or whether he points to a system in which there is no syntactic level without the semantic level, and symbols are not possible without the syntactic levels. In dialogue, Plato establishes his ontology from the main idea that ontology, which expresses itself in language, must make the idea of language possible rather than denying or neglecting it. He shows the aporias of three types of basic ontologies that make logos impossible. First, the Paramedian hypothesis of the absolute unity of being as a rejection of multiplicity. This idea can be seen as the absolutization of the principle of identity underlying every thought and reality. The statement, Socrates is human, couldn't represent reality since Socrates and human are not identical. If we take being in the sense of absolute identity, this leads us to the following formula, which we would express transitively as being is being, that is, which in the last instance removes the transitivity and predicative structure of language and leads being to have stand-alone identity without predication. We will later see how Plato, in response to this problem, states that the transitive structure of mixture of kinds of being and non-being constitutes the essence of the language. Moreover, he lets logoi, such as Socrates is human, emerge by departing from the idea of absolute identity and by allowing the harmonic pairing of the names. Second, the multiplicity as eide, which remain the same without interactions nor changes, is generally attributed to Plato, but we will later argue that it should rather be attributed to Aristotle. This idea supposes that names, universals, and concepts can stand alone and isolated from others. Third, multiplicity as a mixture of everything where no element can maintain its proper identity. According to Plato, such a unification is not possible because if the elements don't preserve their identity in a unification, it would lead to the absence of unification since there is nothing to mix up. After criticizing this hypothesis, Plato presents his ontology as an interactive multiplicity in which many eide can enter communion with others while preserving their identity. Having thus described the frame of the Sophist discussion, we can now begin our examination of the passages concerning letters. Plato speaks of a form of communion that at first glance appears to be a simple analogy to his new ontology, communion of letters, grammata. The analogy, however, takes a different turn when considering its context in the dialogue, since the text is about finding the logos to capture the Sophist. When in a text about logos, the letters, which are parts of the logos, are used as analogies to explain logos, the analogy goes beyond merely being an analogy. It also actually informs us about the reality of logos and letters. Plato states The vowels now, they differ from the other letters, running through them all and serving like a bond between them, so that without a vowel, it's impossible for any of others to fit together either. How should this expression be understood? I will try to answer this question by suggesting that the concept which Plato is trying to point out in this passage is the articulation of letters, and that letters can only appear as letters in an articulated structure. Letters in human language can be articulated as they are differentiated into vowels and non-vowels to produce multiple names. Therefore, letters can only be letters with a harmonic communion in articulation and form names with groups of letters which are able to signify the multiplicity within topan, whereas sounds that are not articulated don't consist of letters. At this point, I'd like to discuss an important use of grapho, which has the same root as gramma in Perihermenias of Aristotle, who kept using Plato's conceptualization of gramma and stokeion. Aristotle states, that which is in sounds are signs of pathemata in soul, and that which is written are signs of that which is in sounds. This statement basically marks that the pathemata are formed by the things, and we signify them with what is in sound. We signify what is in sound with grammata. Giorgio Agamben comments on this expression in Infancy and History as following: Aristotle's ancient commentators had asked why the philosopher had introduced the gramma as fourth hermeneut alongside the other three, voice, pathemata, things, which explained the circle of linguistic signification. So they attributed the particular status of gramma to the fact that, unlike the other three, it is not just a sign, but also an element, stokeion, of the voice as articulation. According to this interpretation, things, their pathemata, and that which is in sound as elements of the circle of signification are completed only when they are able to be symbolizable in writing, that is, have possibility to be articulated. In his commentary on Perihermenias, Boethius remarks on this structure as follows: that which is in sounds, names and remata, indicate thoughts that correspond to things. However, not every sound can be a name and a rema, but when that which is in sounds only are written, represented by letters, the linguistic circle is completed, and to this utterance, locutio, one may assign a sense. In the same commentary, Boethius comments that the sense is not assignable to every sound, but only to the articulated utterance, and says, the components of utterance are letters, which when joined, create a conjoined and combined spoken sound, which is called utterance. We could interpret Boethius' idea as retroactive movement in which only the sounds having the power to be symbolized by letters can be assigned meaning, since only the parts of these sounds can be decomposed and captured as units in their relation to each other. This means that the sounds must be presented in such a unification model that the letters can be captured separately from each other, which is what we call articulation. In the Sophist, Plato uses the concept of gramma, which is connected to etymology of writing and that which is written, instead of using the concept of stokeion, which means both the elements and letters as used in Theaetetus. In this regard, considering one, the ancient commentaries on Aristotle's grammar. Second, Plato's choice of the concept of grammar instead of stokeion. Third, his articulated model of the communion of letters. And fourth, Plato's ontological position in which everything, topan, is possible only in a measured way of the communion of things. We can develop the following idea about the Plato's approach to the letters and therefore logos. Articulated sounds emerge only with the capacity of being symbolized by singular letters in writing, even though they are not practically symbolized. In this sense, we can say that Plato thinks that each of grammata, which is part of the logos, preserves its singularity, but at the same time, the grammata come together in an articulated way, and therefore each one is kept as a letter. Therefore, the activity of putting it in communion and at the same time grasping them separately is the reason that we have articulated symbols. that is letters. When a human cries and inanimate objects or animals make noises, they are not composed of letters, even though they look like articulated sounds, since their parts cannot be grasped as a singular symbols. Then, I mean that the ability of grasping symbols as entities is irreducible to the separation of physical entities that can be attributed to the animal's articulation. For example, a wolf can howl, ow, or a human can groan in pain. These noises that the wolf makes when howling cannot be represented by the letters articulated in writing and therefore in sounds, since this voice contains an inseparable continuity. That is, the parts of the noises cannot be grasped as a singular symbol. One can match these examples of howls and groans with both the Paramedian position as a holistic position that rejects the multiplicity and the extreme mixture hypothesis in which the mixture of the multiplicity leaves no separable singularity. Both can be seen as a wolf howl compared to the Platonic logos containing articulation. Thus, letters can only be letters when captured as interconnectable singularities, and meaning can only be assigned to the names that emerge from their communion. Here we can refer to the distinctions between abstractable and extractable developed by Weil in his article Letters and Syllables in Plato. Abstractable is the part that cannot be captured from the whole, but can still be considered separately, while extractable that can be captured by separating from the sum. According to this distinction, we can qualify letters as abstractables, but not as extractable. I will continue to justify this claim by referring how similarly it is sustained in the Sophist, in which the predication of names and the accord of logoi are parallel to the letters. After explaining his ontology based on the letters model, established with the communion of eidos or genos preserving their identity, Plato begins to explain how the logos is predication of names. Plato explains the structure of logos by taking two types of communions as a model, eide and letters. As we said at the beginning, logos, which is presented as a genos that connects tagene, is surprisingly in the same kind with the things that it unifies, that is, genos or eidos. Therefore, the communion of eide is beyond being took as an example because it is logos itself. Apart from that, although Plato used other analogies, for example, harmony of notes in music, for grounding his ontology, he only refers to letters besides eidos when constructing logos. These choices reveal that Plato sees continuity between the two structures, letters and logos. When we look at the passages, we see that the logos consist of an onoma and a rema. However, when a rema is predicated to an onoma, a logos emerges, in which we find the second linguistic meaning of koinonia, predication of names. In this sense, logos would not emerge if onomata and remata weren't combined in the form of predication. Alongside this idea, Plato hides a more interesting idea in these passages. Onoma and rema acquire meaning only within the logos. If we look closely at the text, we see that Plato states that although we put remata in succession, walks, runs, sleeps, they don't form a logos. Likewise, the three continuous names don't form a logos either: lion, stag, horse. We can interpret Plato's characterization of names as continuous as they don't constitute a judgment by falling into an inseparable unity, since they don't form logos without a verb. Thus, they don't indicate a praxis or being. We can think of this in parallel with the example of a wolf howling, since in both situations, the parts lose their identity in the unification. On the contrary, the verbs in succession can very well signify since every verb refers to a praxis, and since Greek permits to have a logos only with a rema without any onoma, unlike modern English. Then, where there are three remata, there must be three logos too. So why does Plato, who is aware that a logos can be formed with only one verb in Greek, says otherwise. The answer is hidden in the phrases just after the examples. These groups don't constitute logos until someone starts blending the verbs with the names. Then they fit together and their first interweaving is at one speech. These groups of words don't indicate praxis and being or their absence unless they are a mixture of nouns and verbs. So only in the case of unity, these parts gain meaning. This doesn't mean that we cannot make a phrase with only a verb. So what can it mean? To fully understand this statement, we must think with the condition that every logos must be about something which Plato expresses in the following lines. In this regard, Plato states two conditions of being a logos which can be seen as an activity of judgment that predicates erema to onoma. First, there must be a subject to be predicated, and second, there must be a praxis or being to predicate to the subject either positively or negatively. So we can say that onomata and remata have a meaning only in as much as they are a subject and predicate in a communion of predication. This is what we called before as Plato's transitive structure of language. If we follow Ryle's conceptualization for letters here, we can say names and remata can be abstracted but not extracted. They originally belong to the judgments. At this point, we can refer to the idea of concept, Begrifflichkeit, developed by Immanuel Kant. Kant, who defined the concepts as functions of judgments, constructed them in such a way that we can only catch them in the correlations of judgments which have a syntactic structure. It is not possible to grasp concepts out of functions of judgments. Parallel to Kant, Plato too states an idea of name that indicates a function as a logos and is found always in logoi. So names and remata are seen as names and remata only when they function as a correlation surrounded by a logos, and therefore they are located in the web of correlations. This approach is opposed to the classical Aristotelian logic and substance theory, since according to Aristotle's logic, there is a drastic distinction between what are said separately and what are said together, the latter being composed of the former. What are said separately emerge initially from the first universals that are produced from the pathemata left in the soul by separated substance to which everything is predicated to them in nature. Nous draws them through the process of epagogia induction, and then these universals are used as elements, principles of the logos, and later of the syllogism, as they are part of the episteme. The synthetic episteme level, which works with the predicate system, is based on these isolated universals which precede the predicate system. So these universals owe their independent individuality and origin to the entities that exist on their own, that is, to substance. In this sense, we can position Aristotelian thought in the second ontological hypothesis, which was attributed to Plato, the entities as individuals not mixing with each other. On the contrary, according to Plato, everything composed of all kinds is caught in communion by logos. Parallel to this idea, onomata and remata are only found in logos. Instead, Aristotle defines the logos not as predication of names, but as groups of names. He didn't limit the definition of logos to the only communion of onoma and rema as predication, but expanded it to onoma groups, since the definitions, horos, they don't carry predicate or copula, are also logoi. The definitions are then logoi that the names point to without being judgments. This Aristotelian idea is opposite of Plato's ontology of communion of gene, which are conjoined by the logoi. Since it is assumed that the names that are not caught in the judgments still refer to objects captured as fixed extractable entities in the outside world, which has been the dominant philosophical view for centuries as the basic assumption of the substance metaphysics. However, according to Plato, everything captures its singularity and identity in the relation to each other. He clearly states the structure of the logos in the following passage of the Sophists. We would be both amusikos and aphilosophos, and would have worked against the harmony if we hadn't had the connection of logos, which connects things in a synthetic relationship and captures them as one in this relationship. He states that he will lose the title of musikos, which signifies the activities that make human, and says that without logos, man will leave his humanity and he will not be able to catch the harmony of topan, so that he will not be able to capture individual things and the relations between them, which basically means that there will be no knowledge. Kant expresses this point in the Critique of Pure Reason as follows: if every individual representation were entirely foreign to the other, as it were isolated and separated from it, then there would never arise anything like cognition, which is a whole of compared and connected representations. By comparing with the aforementioned passage of Sophist, we can see that Kant admirably translated in modern language what Plato meant by amusikos and aphilosophos. In other words, the idea that things cannot be known in isolation from each other without the relation of logos, in which case there will be no knowledge, is common to both philosophers. This idea is completely parallel to the communion of articulation that we defined in the letters. Just as letters can only come together in names through articulation and can be thought of as one by abstraction, names too can only emerge in judgments but can be grasped as isolated ones through abstraction. The research on the communion of letters as articulation in names and communion of names as predicates in logoi can only be completed by considering how the communion of logoi takes place. To examine this communion, we will consult to the very interesting concept of Plato, homologia. The concept of homologia is so important to the dialogue that it appears in the opening sentence and all throughout the text. The homologia has two aspects. First, while the logos separates and combines the ideas, they do it in agreement with their nature, for which Plato often uses the concept of harmony. This also necessitates the successive logos to be homologous, harmonic with each other. Since kinds preserve their identity only in a harmonic communion with each other, logos can remain harmonic to the kinds that they connect only in such an agreement. In this sense, each logos finds its meaningful place only when the whole of the language is connected to each other in a harmonic and homologous way. Plato explains this side of logos in page 253. The function of the logos here can be seen as closer to the consciousness or mind, which makes conceptual distinctions and separates objects as we position them today, but in a way not subjective. The logos and onoma system, which enables us to capture a human as an individual, on the one hand, gives the possibility of both separating it from gathering it with other concepts. On the other hand, the possibility of keeping in it relation to them. To explain more the first sense of the concept of homologia, we can refer to Plato's conceptualization of dialectics or episteme of philosophers. In these passages, the dialectician is defined as a person having the capacity or force, dunatos, that separates the different, keeps the same together, and creates relations between these entities, and therefore dialectics is defined as this capacity, dynamis. How is dynamis defined in the Sophist, and in what function is it used? Plato gives the definitions of being as having dynamis, and he defines having capacity dynamis as affecting poiein or being affected pathein. In parallel, Plato defines knowing as affecting. Based on the definition of episteme as capacity and capacity as affecting and being affected, we will try to understand episteme through the concepts of affecting and being affected. So if we accept that episteme has two aspects, one active and another passive, we have to keep in mind that contrary to this hypothesis, Plato generally states in his other texts that the knowing activity is a passive process in which the soul is being affected by the idea. Whereas we can interpret that in the Sophist, Plato has developed the concept of knowing by adding an active meaning and by not limiting it within a passivity. The activity of separating the existence and gathering them together in their relations in terms of logos, both are seen as an active activities in this text. This is where the meaning of the logos comes into play, presenting the singularities of the whole to us harmonically in relation to each other as separating the different and combining the identical. In this sense, dialectics is not a special, local, or technical knowledge. It is the knowledge of the things that are the basis of all knowledge. Consequently, dialectics is making accord of logoi and names to the harmony and segmentation of pragmata, and therefore the meanings of the first aspect of homologia is making logos harmonic to the pan, which is composed of tabragmata through the capacity of episteme. The second aspect, homologia, is the advancement of the sides in conversation towards mutual agreement, homologia, since the basic function of language is the agreement of the reciprocal sides. The agreement of the sides, on one hand, can occur within an only person talking to himself, as Plato defines thought, which is intertwined with the first aspect of the concept. On the other hand, it also means that the sides are in agreement within dialogue, which is also a possibility of realizing the dialectics. As we said, the Sophist starts on an agreement, homologia, and ultimately aims to agree on the Sophists. In this sense, the condition and telos of dialectical dialogue is homologia. At the end of the text, the concept of the Sophists wrapped in logos is placed in a harmonic place with its activity, ergon, and both parties agree on this. In this sense, the dialogue takes the homologia itself as the telos. This homologia is provided not by the personal position of the parties, but by the activity of the name, which is surrounded by logos. To explain the concept of homologia in its second aspect, we need to refer to the Gorgias. For you are my friend, as you say yourself. Hence, any agreement between you and me, any homologia between you and me, must really have attained to the telos of aletheia. Dialectically, written dialogues work on the principle of mutual homologia agreement, since language is what provides mutual understanding. In this regard, we can talk about the political role of the logos as it is employed by the citizens of the polis. The logos attains authentic homologia in the external and objective agreement of people in mutual dialogue, rather than one person thinking alone. In this regard, the first sense of homologia constitutes the basis of the second and final sense, since due to the Platonic position, homologia cannot be reached by departing from the subjective positions, but it can only be reached departing from an objective position which corresponds to the harmony of topan, independent from the subjective positions. Therefore, attaining the homologia through logos will permit us to reach the homologia through dialogue. As a result, we can say that logos also gains singularity and meaning in homologia accord consensus as the third aspect of linguistic koinonia. We can say that this firstly occurs when the logoi attain harmony with one another and with everything, and secondly, it occurs as the real meaning of language as realized in mutual agreement in dialogue. Finally, to conclude my lecture, I will say that according to Plato, the three aspects of linguistic koinonia, the articulation of letters, the predication of names, and the homologia, accord of logoi, can only happen thanks to each other, and none of them can precede the other, neither logically or ontologically, unlike modern formal logic. All these levels of linguistic koinonia require each other necessarily. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Taha. Well, we can open the questions. This time I'm looking at the list. I begin with the question. How do you understand the Cratylus in the context of your description of Plato's view about letters, name, and logos, especially thinking about the meaning of letters? How the Cratylus fits this scheme?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Interesting question. I'm seeing the Cratylus dialogue like the dialogue doesn't discuss or argue the logos or the communion of the logos or the names. Mostly it discusses the concepts and how we can arrange the concepts with their nature in Pan. But in the Sophist dialogue, Plato discussed like how logos merge everything and how it resembles everything, and in this syntactic communion, how the things they gain their individuality. But in Cratylus, it's more the dialectician. He finds the problem in the concepts in our daily language, and he finds their meaningful place. And he posits these concepts in a suitable way to their nature.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? We have convinced everybody. Well, perhaps in the end, now we are going to continue with the work of Pauline Sabrier from the University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. The title of her work is Why Don't Change and Rest Combine with One Another, Reconsidering the Communion of Kinds in Plato's Sophist. Please, Pauline.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. Let me try to share my presentation with you. It starts bad because I don't seem. Wait a second. Why is it? Oh yes, sorry, I find it now. Okay, so you should be able to share my screen now, and I'll try to make it full screen. Let's. Good. So everything fine? You can see your screen and hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So let's start. So my paper today is actually dedicating to a very specific case of koinonia, namely as a koinonia that takes place between being, change, and rest in Plato's Sophist. So the communion of kinds is one of the central themes developed in Plato's Sophist. And in this development, change and rest play a pretty important role because they are those recurrent examples of things that precisely do not combine with one another. So they are therefore the Eleatic stringent support for the claim that of the kind of the forms, some combine with one another, but some don't. Now, although they play this important role precisely in that respect, this claim that change and rest do not combine with one another has proved particularly problematic. And there are two main reasons scholars usually mention when they think about this. First of all, because there seems to be a tension between the claim that change and rest do not combine and the claim that change and rest are greatest kinds. And also because, as scholars have pointed out, I mean, insofar as change is a form or a kind, certainly change is a resting thing and accordingly should participate in rest. So because of this, critics have often been tempted either to deny that change and rest are properly graded kinds, or to find or to deny that we should take seriously or very strongly the claim that that change and rest do not combine with one another. So in my paper today, I want to take a different approach to this problem. So the claim I'm going to defend, if as the explanation for this, namely, the explanation for the claim that change and rest do not combine with one another is to be found in the specificity of the communion among being, change, and rest. And more precisely, I'm going to argue that it is found in this claim that change and rest are encompassed, so appear a common by being. And while while arguing for this, I shall make two additional claims. So the first one is that I'm going to argue that the way being, change, and rest combine with one another corresponds to the line at 253d7, so the line in that notoriously difficult dialectic passage. I shall come back to this in a second. And the second claim I'm going to defend is that what is meant by the claim that being encompasses change and rest is that being is different from change and rest, but also that being is not separate from them. So in order to do this, let us start by looking at a passage where the claim that there is koinonia among being, change, and rest in the Sophist is first introduced. And that passage is the one you see on the left of the screen now, so that 250b7 and 10 passage. So we are right after the Gigantomachia passage, and there the Eleatic stranger says, in that case, in your mind, you're assuming that being is a third thing over and above this, on the basis that both rest and change are embraced by it. So I'm mostly interested in that phrase that is in bold here, namely that claim that rest and change are embraced by being. And this is particularly interesting because if we look ahead, so at this dialectic passage I mentioned already at 253d5 now, we did find indeed a very similar formulation about the second of the options, about the way things can combine with one another. So this is again the text that you have in bold here on the screen. So the person who can do this then surely is well enough equipped to see when, and then the first option, and the second, that one bit interested me, when many forms that are different from one another are embraced from the outside by one. So on the face of it, these two passages are indeed very similar, and especially because they use this same verb, row, translate, embraced, enclosed. And there are only three occurrences of this term in the Sophist, which makes it all the more plausible that there is a connection between those two passages, namely that the way being, change, and rest combine, as is introduced in the 250 passage, is indeed an example of what there is under 2 here in the 243 passage. But what does it mean exactly that change and rest are encompassed by being? And more generally, if I'm right that there is this connection between the 250 and the 253 passage, how generally, what do we mean when we say that a plurality of kinds or forms is encompassed by one form or one kind? So to answer that question, I'm going to ask a slightly different question, namely, how does the Eleatic stranger come to the conclusion that change and rest are encompassed by being? In order to answer that question, we need to go back just a few lines before the 253 passage, is the 250 passage you saw here. So basically back to 250a8, when the Eleatic stranger starts the argument whose conclusion is precisely the claim that being is a third thing and encompasses change and rest. So let's see how this passage works. So one very interesting point about this passage is its similarity with another passage that is way earlier in the Sophist, when the problem of being is first discussed, and the views of, let's call them the dualist, is discussed. So the dualist, they hold the view that the hot and the cold are all that varies. And there, the Eleatic stranger asks them, well, what do you mean when you say that the hot and the cold are all that varies? Do you mean that being is the same as the hot or the cold, or the couple hot and the cold taken together, or something different? So we have something very similar taking place in this 250 passage. So the Eleatic stranger tests the conclusion at which Theaetetus and himself have arrived at the end of the Gigantomachia passage, and say, well, at the end of the Gigantomachia passage, we have said that being or the totality is all things changing and changeless. What do we mean by being here? Do we mean that being is the same as either change or rest? Do we mean that being is different from both change and rest? Or do we mean that being is a couple change and rest taken together? Now, unlike in the hot and cold passage, where those dualist thinkers, they had not been able to answer that question because all three options had turned out to be disastrous for their own views. In the 250 passage, Theaetetus and the Eleatic strangers can show that they have made some progress because they are able to say that option 2 on their view is the correct view, namely the view that being is different from change and rest. Now, the interesting point for my purpose is to see how the Eleatic stranger comes to this conclusion. For what is striking is, if you look at the logic of the argument, is that option 2 is not chosen as a result of a denial of the other two options. Rather, what happens is that option 1 is presented. Option 1 is said to be not wrong or inadequate, and it is immediately concluded from this that option 2 is the correct one. That is, without examining option 3. Option 3 is then mentioned and ruled out, but it has already been established from that option 2 is the correct one. So how is this possible? How can the Eleatic stranger know, just by denying that option 1 is correct, that option 2 is a right one without having to examine option 3? So to do this, we need to review the argument, how it works. So option 1 starts in the following way. Change and rest are most opposed to one another, but in spite of this, change being is said of them in the same way. And since change and rest are opposites, being cannot be either the same as change or the same as rest. Otherwise, being could not be said also of the other. And from this, the Eleatic stranger concludes that then, therefore, being is different from change and rest taken together. Oops, sorry, taken separately. FC1 is I've anticipated something, because what I think here is actually that if we look at this argument, what seems to be clear is that the pivotal claim that can lead to the conclusion is that change and rest are opposite, and that this is that premise that does a job of coming to the conclusion. And it seems to me that that very same premise indeed does at the same time and in the same way rule out that being can simply be identical with change and rest taken together. So that's what I've inserted here. It's not the order of the text, it's the order of my reconstruction, precisely for the same reason that being cannot be identical with the hot and the cold. In the same way, being couldn't be identical with the sum or to couple change and rest taken together, because if it were so, then when we say that change is, it would mean that changes and rests, and this is something that is not acceptable, since change and rest are opposites. So the crux of his arguments lies in the assertion that change and rest are opposites, and so the crux of his intuition is that the change and rest are opposites, and it's central for the argument for option 2. So we can, as an intermediate conclusion, we can also say that the claim that being encompasses change and rest is related to the conclusion that being is different from change and rest, taken either collectively or individually. But is it all that there is to the claim that change and rest are encompassed by being? What I now want to try to suggest is that there is actually more to this claim than just the claim that being is different from change and rest. And in particular, I want to argue what I said earlier already, namely not only that being is different from change and rest, but also that being is not separate from change and rest. So let me now argue for B here. I think there are different reasons for taking B here. The first reason is simply that it is just at first sight plausible or consistent with the vocabulary of encompassing that we have in that passage, because intuitively we could indeed say of things that are encompassed by another that we are not, that there is a sense in which we are not separated from it. But there might be examples, especially, and even examples in Plato. I'm thinking of an example that Marily's Gill talks about mountains and lake, where this is not the case. It's not really, there's no really sense of being not separated. So just our intuition cannot do the job here. But I think there is a more important and more interesting philosophical reason to give for the claim that being actually is not separated from change and rest from this passage. And this conclusion has to do with being. So at the end of the Gigantomachia passage, so at 249 D3-4, the eleatic strangers and Theaetetus have come to the conclusion that being encompasses all that which is changes and all that is changeless. In other words, it seems to be suggesting if you take all changing and changeless things together, then you have the totality of existing things. Now, if this is so, then the claim that being is a third thing, or that the claim that being is different from change and rest, that is a claim that being is itself neither a changing thing or a resting thing, is very problematic. Because it seems to mean that being is actually different from what there is. And this suggestion is identified by the eleatic stranger and Theaetetus themselves as indeed problematic, because how could being possibly be different from what there is? Now, I think that if we take the language of the eleatic stranger at face value here, and so we take seriously this claim that being encompasses change and rest, this seems to point to a possible solution to this problem, namely to the problem of being different from what there is. For whatever encompasses something is outside of it, but is not separate or distinct from it. In other words, we would certainly say that that what encompasses is not identical with what encompassed, but we would not thereby imply that it is something completely different or unrelated to it. So if this is correct, then by saying that being is different from, is a third thing, so is different from change and rest, so the eleatic stranger is not thereby implying that they are unrelated to them. Nor does it entail that being it is not identical with what there is, in no way is. So in this way, this would allow us to take seriously the claim that being is neither a changing thing or a resting thing, while avoiding the pitfall that being in no way is. So along these lines, being would be something like the limits of the things that are, without itself being a further thing that is. So this is my philosophical reason, so to speak, for wanting to take seriously this claim that that being encompasses a change and rest, as making the claim that it's different from change and rest, but not unrelated to them. Now, if we look for some textual confirmation that this could be an interesting way, or perhaps a plausible way of understanding that encompassing relation, I would like to go back to my 253 passage at the beginning, because there, very interestingly, we do have a lot of mention of this separation thing. So especially if you compare option 1 and option 2, there is a lot that option 1 and option 2 have in common, since they are all about a plurality of forms and their relation to one single form. But on option 1, it's clearly said that that those forms are separate, whereas on option 2, this claim is not made. So if I think this is some further textual support, and that's what is one idea that is carried by this idea of encompassing is precisely whatever is encompassing is not separate from what it encompasses. Now, if this is correct, I'll go back to my, yes. So if this is correct, then it means that B is based on the role of that change and rest play in an account of what there is. So the special role they play at the end of the Gigantomachia passage, and not on an examination of change and rest in themselves. So having said that, and I'm nearly at the end, are we in a better position to answer our initial question? Namely, are we in a better position to answer our question, why don't change and rest combine with one another? Well, I think we are. So the first thing is that what we have seen that's a crucial role of the claim, we have seen the crucial role that the claim that change and rest are opposites play in the argument about the relation between being, change, and rest. So we have seen that this is on this basis that the eleatic stranger can come to the conclusion that option 2 is the correct one. But more than this, the claim that change and rest do not combine with one another has also found some sort of explanation, because what we see with this idea that with the encompassing relation here, Plato means not only different, but not separated off. It means that change and rest are considered not in their self, but always in their role in an account of being, since this is the explanation I have proposed to make sense of this claim. So if this is correct, then indeed we do find some help to understand this striking claim that change and rest do not combine with one another is the specificity of the communion among the three, namely as being characterized by this encompassing relation that I've described as not only involving that being is different from change and rest, but also as involving that being is not separate from change and rest. So on this, I'll stop here, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pauline. Well, we have some time for questions. Martin, please.
I wonder if more might not be needed to reject your option 3, whether P4 is really sufficient. A simple example would be, which was raised yesterday, I think, the example of Socrates and Hippias being 2 together, neither of them being 2. In other words, the property of 2 does not necessarily apply to each of them individually. And so that what you're saying about change would have to be changing and resting, or rest would have to be resting and changing, I'm not sure that applies. They could both be being, they could still be a couple, without the property, all of the property of being applying to each of them individually, change and rest. So I don't think P4 is an adequate rejection of option 3, that being and rest are a couple.
Okay, well, thanks for your suggestion. I'm happy with this. I don't really mind about this, but then how do you explain it? Because again, the constraint of explaining is just you have to explain this on the basis of what just of what proceeds, and there's not that much in those preceding lines. So what would be your option to say that if you think this is not P4 doesn't work?
Well, I'm open. I want to say that I think the option of there being a couple still remains. I don't see that that's rejected by the language in the second of your list of 4 possible relations of forms.
Okay, well, I'm a bit confused now, because if you go back to 250 to the 250 passage. So 250 B710. So there's isn't it the case that the treat and T option is accepted, and then there's the ara that kind of shows that it's a conclusion, and on the next line, doesn't it? Actually, the Eleatic Stranger's line says that it's not being is not kinesis and change and rest taken together, and then the just give is a proval. So if you don't think that's enough to think that this option is rejected, then I'm not so sure what make you think the opposite. Okay, well,
I don't want to take up more time, but at the very least, I don't think your P4 would hold on the basis of parallel.
All right, so I'll think about it. Thank you. Yes.
George?
You have to unmute yourself, yes.
Thank you for your talk, Pauline, and thank you for the help you've given me to my own paper. I want to ask you about the 2 uses you mentioned where the stranger uses the verb periekkein. And I wanted to ask how you interpret the 3rd passage where he talks about periekkein, where in that case, it looks like the thing that encompasses is not the same as the thing that's inside. This is the passage where he says, wicker baskets, seines, snares, and nets catch fish by surrounding them. And I'm not sure how you would interpret this.
Thank you. So I didn't mention it because I thought you would go into it in your talk tomorrow. And actually, I'm quite happy with what you say about this. So basically, my point is not to deny that one important aspect of this encompassing relation, whatever else it is that whatever encompasses is different from what is encompassed. And that I would certainly not deny as an important component. I think what I'm just doing is adding another one. I'm suggesting that there is more to the encompassing relation than just being being different, and I'm suggesting that this is, well, we are different, but we are not separated. And then I've tried to justify it in two ways, basically with this reference to the Koinonia passage, and also with a reference to the 253 DE dialectic passage. But on the whole, I don't think, I mean, my impression was that you couldn't make the non-separation claim on the basis of this passage at the beginning, so 220, 220 something, I can't remember the exact reference. That was my impression, that there you would mostly get the first of these two aspects of this encompassing relation in this difference aspect, but not necessarily the separation. Because intuitively, okay, you might indeed say that there is a sense in which we, sufficiency and nets are not separate in that moment, but yeah, whether this is very convincing, I'm not sure. What do you think yourself?
I think the relation between the basket and the fish shows that if we want a univocal sense to periekane, it can't be the sense of sense that entails that they are the what's the word, not separate, because they do seem to be separate.
Yes, no, indeed. But then I think it's more, if you just take the difference claim somehow, yes, then more difficulties may come, especially when you try to distinguish how option 2 in the 253 passage does differ from option 1, because the chorus part plays an explicit role at least in 2 options, in 1 and 4, and in 2 and 3 it's not mentioned, and in 3 I'd say it's not my impression that it's not mentioned because they are indeed also not separated, but that's another issue. So perhaps then that would be something you have to explain in other ways there. Yes. Now, whether we have to find a single account of this encompassing for all the cases, those that look more let's call them more technical or less technical, is a good question. I'm not so sure that this would be necessary. I think the most important, I'd say that the most important part is that the 250 passage and the 253 passage somehow agree, because they are very close to one another and they're related to the same point. Whether, yes, with the 220, perhaps it's okay, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very detailed analysis. I have just one little question. If when a little later, 256b, it's 6 to 8 in Robinson's edition. I was wondering how you evaluate that sentence in the context of your analysis, because it's a really striking where he says, "Upun kan aipe met lambanen autekinesis stasios." So if somehow movement itself participates in movement, in rest, it wouldn't be strange to call it in some sense also resting. Very rough translation on the fly, and there it seems that they do get in some connection with one another. I mean, it's really strange, and I was really wondering how you evaluate that sentence.
Yes, so I evaluate that sentence as a counterfactual. So it seems to be just a counterfactual all throughout. So I don't see any positive points to be made of this. So yes, that was basically my reply here. This is just a concept. It's a counterfactual, but the if clause is never meant, so there's just no point about it. Yes.
Okay, so the subsequent question would be why it doesn't there, but that's a different thing. That's not part of your, or not for your argument. Thank you.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, this passage is usually mentioned by those who precisely doubt that we should take that claim very seriously, that change and rest don't combine with one another. But I really, I mean, just from the line itself, it seems to be really an unfulfilled conditional, and by definition, an unfulfilled conditional isn't fulfilled. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from Yu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pauline. I have a kind of question. If I remember correctly, in Moni Dixon's book, she actually explained this passage in 253, Paramedian again, by the passage in at 250 that you quote, the relation between being, change, and rest, and her way of explaining this, the dialectical relation, the two separate forms encompassed by something, by another form from exterior. And her explanation is that the third thing is actually a non-essential quality. And what I want to ask is if we look into this, between change and rest, they are different, but they share the same relation with being. So they are connected through being. And since what I understand is the passage on dialectics, that the third thing encompasses from exterior but not interior, because they are not this third thing in itself. And I think it is why Dixon said that it must be some non-essential quality of two of them. What I want to ask is, what do you think of this? Because if we take, if we understand that the two separate kind, well, for example, change and rest, they share the same relation to being, so they form some kind of unity without then self-associating one with another. In a sense, this kind of unity is kind of, I think, less strong than a unity combined from the interior, because it's for me it seems a kind of relational unity. That means that the unity actually depends on a common relation to a certain thing. So but in this sense, being somehow is still separate from both of them, but it can actually unify or create a unity out of their common relation to being. How do you think of this?
Yes, so there are many things in what you say. So one first remark about the exotic, and so the from outside, that is clearly in the 253 option, 253 formulation, but that is not at least at first in the 250 option, in the 250 formulation. Sorry. And actually, if we look a bit further, there is a moment where it says that being seems to be ectos, so outside change in dress. So it's just a few lines later, 250 D2. So I don't think this makes a difference between what we get at 253 and what we have at 250. Now, the sense of, there's another difference, and I think that relates to your question about unity. There's another difference between the two passages, is that if you look closely at the formulation at 253, it's just about those forms or kinds, that they are heteros, so that they're just different. But what we have seen in the 250 passage, and that is what is emphasized in the 250 passage, is that they are not only, if we think about change and rest, they are not only different, they're enantiotata, so they are most opposed to one another. My suggestion here would be to say that the 253 formulation is broader than the 250 formulation, and you could have under this 2 in a 253 both cases where whatever is encompassed are opposites, like in the case of change and rest, but that may not be a necessary requirement. It may just be that whatever is encompassed by this other form or kind are just different. And if we look at this in that way, perhaps you could think as well that there might be a difference of unity between the two, and that in a sense, something that would again, taking very seriously this claim about encompassing, and which I think actually, if we take it as involving not only difference but non-separation, squares well with your idea that this form a unity, a kind of whole, let's say. Probably I'd say that there's a case where whatever is encompassed are opposites, and this has less unity perhaps than in other cases where there is no opposition between what the things that are encompassed here. But this is just a thought in which this would not need to be probably shown. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I have a follow-up? Well, it's just to ask if for you, the relation between being, change, and rest, do you think it's the same, like, for example, between size, big and small?
No.
Okay, and why is that?
It depends because you'd say that big and small would play the role of change and rest, and yes. And size would play the role of being.
Yes.
Well, if what I've been arguing is on the right line, see the way you arrived at this special relation among the three, namely as not only treaty but hopefully encompassed by being, is actually based on the Gigantomachia passage. And if this is correct, then this seems to me to be based on a special role change and rest have played in that passage. So especially this claim that they are most opposed to one another, so that the very same thing cannot be both changing and at rest. But perhaps this is not something you want to say about the members of, taking again size, big and small. Perhaps you want to say that that the same thing can be big and small in different respects. So that would be that would be a difference between these two cases.
Okay.
Thank you, Pauline. Well, we are on time. Thank you all for this very interesting session, and we'll continue on a whole.
We continue on 15:30. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.